All right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. Right now, we are joined by 4 classes from across North America, so I want to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out. We've got Miss Christensen's grade 4 through 8 in guys. We've got Miss Mossman Cross's grade 2s in Sterling, Ontario. Hi, guys. Little lower pitch, I like it. We've got Mr. Cameron's grade 5 through 6s in Thunder Bay, Ontario. And with their audio not working, but totally excited to be here, we've got Mrs. Demi Anakos' grade 4s in Nepean, Ontario. It's a very Ontario-based hangout today. We're very excited. Of course, the reason you guys are all here is that we are joined live from Gatineau, Quebec by Dr. Jennifer Provencher. She is the head of the Wildlife Health Unit for the Canada Wildlife Service, part of Environment and Climate Change Canada. And she's going to tell us a little bit about her work, her background, her history, and how human activities affect seabirds in Arctic Canada. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Provencher, and take it away.
Awesome. I'm very excited to be here, everybody. If you can hear me, can you give a bit of a wave? Awesome. Excellent work. Okay. So first of all, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Jennifer, and I'm a scientist with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and so I get to work with the Canadian Wildlife Service. So first of all, you might be asking, that looks like a very strange office she's sitting in. It's actually one of our quiet rooms. We actually have kind of an open office concept, and so we have little tiny walls, but they don't go all the way to the ceiling. And so what we have are these little quiet rooms. So this is not my office. It's just an actual quiet room where you can come and have meetings and have calls. So I promise you that my office is actually a little bit more exciting than this. So just a little bit of explanation. But I wanted to be able to chat with you and not have to be quiet. So I've booked a quiet room for us to have this chat today. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you some of the work that I do as a biologist with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And so I work on a whole bunch of different things, but I mostly work on plastic ingestion by wildlife. And so this is one of the things that I've been thinking about and working on for about 10 years. And so most people, when they see or think about plastic, they think about the picture on the far left-hand side. So plastic bottles, washing up on a beach. And those are really important things to think about. One of the things that I think about more, though, is actually the little tiny pieces that you can see in the middle, and what kind of birds or what kind of wildlife actually eat them. So the pieces of plastic in the middle picture on the grid, those are all pieces of plastic that I found inside of a bird. It's called a northern fulmar, and it's a bird that we have on all 3 of Canada's coastlines. And then on the far right, you'll see a picture. It looks like it's been taken under a microscope, and it has. It's actually a very small piece of microplastic found in the poop of some birds. And so I think about all kinds of sizes of plastics, and I think that's actually one of the things I think about most. There are lots of people thinking about plastic pollution, and we know that we're trying to reduce plastic pollution. But one of the things is that we find plastics all over the place. It was great to have so many different schools from across Canada, but mostly Ontario today. And Ontario actually sits on a huge number of waterways. So if there's a lake near you or a river near you, there's probably plastic pollution in it. And that's one of the things that is my job to figure out, is how much plastic pollution is in those different areas, and how does that actually affect wildlife, and specifically birds, because birds are pretty vulnerable to eating plastic. So I'm going to talk a lot more about that. One thing in the plastics world is size matters. And so what we call macroplastics are those kind of big pieces of plastics that are washing up on the shoreline. That's the stuff that you can see, or if you're walking down the road, you kind of see plastics on the road or the sidewalk. Those are all kind of bigger plastics. So we kind of think about those as over 20 millimeters. And those are problems, for larger animals. And these are pieces that whales could ingest. I actually have a colleague that works on a whale shark project in Malaysia, and they found a bottle cap and a piece of a bottle actually stuck in the gills of a whale shark. So these are kind of big plastics. The ones that I mostly focus on are things what we call mesoplastics or microplastics. So if you're a bird or a fish, these are the ones that you're most likely to eat at. So you can imagine that birds and fish are kind of both, you know, flying or swimming through the ocean, and they're looking for food. They're looking for fish, other fish, they're looking for zooplankton, and there's all these little bits of plastic that they might see and then gobble up, and that's where I do a lot of my work. But then there's also this really much lower level of plastics called ultrafine plastics or nanoplastics. And this is like the plastics that we find in poop, in bird poop specifically. So that's what we have in our picture. And I think importantly, when we start talking about these little tiny levels of nanoplastics, that's actually the type of plastics that we start thinking about that are as small as cells. And so you can imagine if you have different cells and really tiny little pieces of plastic, that there might be, you know, interactions and actually entering the plastics, or sorry, entering the cells at the really, really low level. So most of us think about plastics, or we've heard about plastics in the news, or talking about plastics. And we think it's actually about these 5 garbage gyres. And so people talk about the Pacific gyre or the Pacific garbage patch. You can see that's the dark red area right in the middle at the top of the screen. So you can see where North America is. You can see where the Great Lakes are. You can see where Lake Ontario is in Ontario. And you know, right in the middle of the Pacific, there's this big density of plastic. And this map is basically what we call like a heat map. And so the blue areas or the white areas is where there's low levels of plastic. And then as the colors get warmer and warmer up into the red, that's where we know that there's lots of different types of plastic. And so we think about garbage kind of being accumulating out in the middle of the ocean. And one of the places that they've done a lot of work on birds actually is in Hawaii. And so in Hawaii, there's a whole bunch of bird colonies, including albatross colonies. And one of the things that they started realizing was that these birds were full of plastics. And so these are actually pictures of Laysan albatross chicks who have died in the colony and started to decompose. And all of these plastics that you can see were actually inside the the bird's stomach. So you can imagine this bird dies and passes away, and then the body starts to decompose, which is natural. The bacteria start to break it down. And what actually is left over is all these plastics, because the bacteria can't break down the plastics inside the stomachs. And so all that plastic stays, and you get these little mounds of plastics everywhere. The other thing that I think about a lot, and this is actually one of the coolest kind of plastic, this is, you know, a plastic and a bird story, but maybe a bird of a different type, is that we also know that plastics can travel all over the world. And so there's this, there was a boat actually that left Hong Kong in 1992, and it was carrying this load of ducks. And so that's a picture of a duck on the left-hand side. And it was a very special type of rubber duck. And it actually was a rubber duck that had no hole in the bottom. So probably most of you have had, you know, bath toys and, you know, maybe even a rubber ducky, and usually you can kind of pick it up and squeeze it and it makes noise or it squirts water. This is a specific type of duck that was manufactured without a hole. And so when they went overboard, instead of taking on water and sinking, that the ducks that kind of fell out of the shipping container just kept floating. And so we actually, and they started this study. Charles Ebsmeyer, who was an oceanographer, started this study where he actually got people, so people who were walking the beaches looking for plastics, he got them to call in and mail these rubber duckies from whatever they found. And so they started showing up in Africa, they started showing up in Australia, throughout Southeast Asia. They started showing up in Japan. You can see in Tacoma, Washington in 1996. And then they started finding them in the Atlantic. And that's really, they didn't really expect that. And so that actually shows that this plastic that is swirling around the ocean can actually travel up and across the Arctic and come out the other side. It can come out into the Atlantic. And so this pattern of kind of plastics moving around the ocean over a really long time is one of those things that taught us that plastic not only stays in the oceans for a long time, but it can move around. Just because you dump it into the Pacific doesn't mean that it stays in the Pacific. And so one of the things that I had never thought about when I was, training and a student was that there was all these different kinds of plastics. And I think the most important part is that there are these industrial plastics. So all plastic comes out of the ground from natural gas or oil, and it gets formed in these little nurdles. But then there's all the user plastics. So these are the water bottles and our toys, everything that we use in plastics. And there's these two types of plastics, and we find them in the environment, and we find them in birds. And it's been estimated that about 20 billion pounds of plastics enter the ocean each year. And unfortunately, there's another picture of a Laysan albatross shrike. It's these plastics that are being dumped in the ocean and being picked up by birds. And so you actually see there's a few bottle caps and other things in that bird's stomach. And I think just to kind of emphasize how much plastic is entering the ocean right now, it's been estimated that there's a dump truck of plastics being put into the ocean every minute around the globe. And so you can imagine that throughout this talk, which hopefully will be about 20 minutes, 20 dump trucks will have, essentially put garbage into the ocean. And throughout the time that we're sitting here, 60 dump trucks will have put the equivalent of plastics into the ocean. So this is happening every day all over the world. So what I do is I actually use seabirds to study plastics, and I do this on all 3 of Canada's coasts. And so this northern fulmar that I mentioned earlier, this is a picture of a northern fulmar. This is up in Prince Leopold Island, which is the top black star on the map that you see. And the picture below it is all the little tiny pieces of plastic that I found in one bird from this bird. And so you can see that there's all kinds of little pieces of plastic in this bird. So you can imagine this bird is a relative of an albatross, or it's probably very similar size to the gulls that you're seeing flying around. So it's not a very big bird, and they can have quite a number of plastics on them. So I'm actually going to give you a bit of a test right now. So there are 4 sampling locations that we work with on seabirds and plastics in Canada. So we have Vancouver Island, which is out on our Pacific coast. We have Prince Leopold Island, which is a small island in the Lancaster Sound area in Nunavut. The Labrador Sea is another one of our sampling locations, so Newfoundland and Nunatsiavut. And then Sable Island, which is a small island off the coast of Nova Scotia, which is a part of Parks Canada. These are our 4 sampling sites that we we basically can go there, we can sample fulmars that have washed ashore on the beach, and then we can look inside their stomachs. And that's part of what I do. And so I want you to remember that there are these 4 sites, and I'm actually going to take myself off because I'm going to give you a little bit of a test. And so can you guys see me now?
Almost. You're further and then back.
I got one more click to go.
There you go. You're set.
Okay, so think about those 4 sites. I have 4 bags of plastics here. So this bag, I'm going to step back for a second. So this bag is like, what if I was a fulmar at one of my sampling sites? This is how much plastic I would have in my stomach. Okay, so this is one location. So you can imagine if I had this in my stomach, or if you had this in your stomach, that you would feel really full, right? You wouldn't be hungry. You wouldn't go and eat, and that's part of the problem. So from one of our sites, this was how much plastic the fulmar equivalent would be. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about the sites on the map. So there was the Pacific, the Arctic, the Labrador Sea, and Sable Island. And so I want you to think, I'm going to show you 4 bags of plastics, and you need to match these bags to those 4 locations. So this is bag 1, and I'm going to tell you this is the heaviest bag. So this, if you were a fulmar from one of those locations, this would be your plastic load, okay? That's bag number 1. The next bag here is a little bit smaller. It actually it weighs less, but it has a higher number of pieces in it. And so you can imagine, right? If I had this in my stomach, it still wouldn't feel good, right? This is, this is a good size of plastic. So this is bag number 2. So which of those locations do you think that this bag fits in? Number 2. Bag 3 has a little bit less. So it's a little bit less. It's still got, quite a size of plastics, but it's not so much. And then our last bag is very small, actually. I don't know if you can see it, maybe there. So you can see that inside this bag, there's very few plastics. So if I had this in my stomach, it would actually be a very small amount of plastics. So this is our 4th site. So you can imagine this is the biggest, right? This is our biggest plastic, and this is our smallest one. Now I want you to think about what of those 4 sites do you think that they match? So you can think about it as which site has the highest plastic, which site has the lowest plastic, and then the 2 in the middle. And I'm going to give you a few minutes to actually think about that with your class and talk to each other. So I'll put back up the map, and then you need to think about where this like big, huge bag of plastics, if you were the bird, this would be your plastics. Or, one of these smaller options. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. 1 is the most plastics, and 4 has the smallest amount of plastics. And I want you to think about it. I'm going to put the map back up for you to see while you think about this, and I'll give you a few minutes to think about it.
Oh, your audio cut out a little bit there, Jennifer.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, so I just showed you those 4 bags, and these are our 4 sites. So what I want you to do, I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about this as a class, and I want you to think about where does the biggest bag of plastics go? Where does the smallest bag of plastics go? And where do you think kind of, 2 and 3 go? So 1 would be the biggest, 2 next smallest, 3 next smallest, 4 smallest. I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about that.
Awesome. While they're doing that too, I want to note we've got quite a few groups watching on YouTube as well. So if you guys want to type in your answers in the chat bar on the right, you can do that. All right. And for the class that just joined us, we're doing an activity right now. You just joined in, but Dr. Provencher just showed a bunch of bags of plastic that represented the plastic that was inside bird's stomach. And so we're using this map that's up on the screen to see which one you think each one of those packages would come from. Which area that they study would birds have the most plastic inside them? Just to avoid you being confused.
Okay, I'll give you about 30 more seconds to get your answers together, and then I'll share what our actual data looks like.
Dun, 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 dun.
That's right, we need some Jeopardy music.
All right.
Okay, so hopefully everyone got a guess and thought about what they think those different plastics would be. And I'm going to tell you right now, before I show you the answers, that almost every person I do this with does not get it all correct. So if you have it wrong, don't worry about it. I actually did this with our Minister McKenna recently, and she is very passionate about this, and she didn't even get it right. And so this is something that I use as a learning tool, and I think it's it's different than most people expect it to be. So the results are, drum roll. Okay, so the answers are the heaviest, most plastic birds are actually found on Sable Island in Nova Scotia. And most people put the heaviest bag over on Vancouver Island. And that has a lot to do with some of the information about the garbage patch in the Pacific, and there was a tsunami in Japan, which of course caused lots of things to wash up on the island. But from a bird perspective, kind of over time, without those very kind of specific events, we actually find the heaviest amount of plastics, which is on Sable Island. And so we talk about the Pacific garbage patch a lot in the news, but the Atlantic also has a garbage patch, and these birds are really close to that garbage patch. Number two, Vancouver Island actually had less plastics in terms of mass, but they had more pieces by number. And so you can imagine that they actually had smaller pieces, but lots of them. And so the birds on Sable Island had heavier plastics, or more plastics, but they were bigger. So in Labrador Sea was number three, and then of course, probably most people get this one right, is that we have the least amount in Arctic Canada. So that's at Prince Leopold, way up in Lancaster Sound, near the community of Resolute Bay. And so that site has our lowest levels, but still we find plastics there, which I think most people don't really think about. The other thing I wanted to show you is this is actually a student of mine. Her name is Sahar. She did her bachelor's in science with us at Carleton, and she looked at the stomach ingestion of these 3 gull species. And so this is a picture of a gull, and this is actually a picture of all the plastics and all the litter that she found in one gull stomach. And I like to show this picture because it shows that it's just not about plastics. You can see that there are plastics for sure in this bird, but there's also aluminum foil, there's rope, there's plywood, there's wax paper, there's all kinds of things. And so while we are very focused on plastics and reducing plastic in the environment, we also think a lot about litter. So it's not just plastic. It's about all this litter that is actually being ingested or eaten up by birds and fish and whales, and actually making them a little bit sick. And so it's not just about plastics, but all these other things as well. And then the other thing that I look at is that I actually find these plastics not only in their stomach. So you can see that when we do our stomach sample, this is a picture of the fulmar on the left, and then this drawing in the middle actually is the schematic, or it's a diagram of their stomach. And so they have the esophagus. You can imagine the food goes into the mouth, down the esophagus, and then it sits in the gizzard or the stomach. And then there's these like long looping, sometimes a meter of intestines. And so we can look in their stomach, which is the first part of their stomach, and we do that a lot. But we also have started looking in their guano sample, or I call it like their poop sample, their pre-poop. It's like just the moment that before they actually pooped out, and we find all kinds of little microplastics in there. And so one of the things that we are thinking more and more about is, if these birds are pooping out plastics, and you have 1,000 birds in one island or one little area, what does that mean? Does that mean that that island is just full of poop and plastics altogether? So that's something that we're thinking more and more about these days in my group. And so when we have birds that are carrying around the plastics, we actually use the word biovectors. And so the birds are these kind of biological movers of the plastic, or biovectors. And then the other thing that we think about a lot in my group is actually plastics as a vector for chemicals. And so most people, when we think about plastics, we think about the physical effects. You can imagine that they are full, they feel full. You can imagine having all that plastic in your stomach. It would be like after a holiday dinner when you have to your pants feel too small, you feel too full. It's kind of like that. But then there's all these other chemical effects. And so chemicals that are put onto the plastics could actually leach off the plastics and enter the bird. And this is some work that we're doing with all of our partners at Acadia University and Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada. So there's all kinds of questions we're trying to figure out around that. And so the other question I get a lot is that, people say, well, wait, is all plastic the same? And so this is actually a graph that we've done at some of the work that we do but it basically just breaks it down into the chemical polymer. And so you can imagine that every plastic is different. So you've got a pink piece of plastic in front of you and a blue piece of plastic, and they might have different additives, they might have different chemicals, they might have different structure. You can imagine soft plastics and hard plastics, they're all different. And they all have fancy names, and they're the chemical names. But we can actually use a machine called a FTIR, and we can take this little piece of plastic and we put it under the machine, and then the machine tells us what the fancy dancy chemical name is. And so I think that's one of the other things that people don't think about, is that we have all kinds of plastics. And so this is just a little bit of data, and you can see all the different names on the right-hand side. And I just kind of show that to you because it's really cool chemistry to make these plastics. But most plastics that we find are nylon, which most people are familiar with, olefin, or polyethylene. And so polyethylene is that hard plastic that most of us know. But it's not everything. There's all kinds of little pieces of plastic made of different types that we are finding inside of birds. And this is just all the pieces of plastic that I found in a bird. So these are the important part is that the wildlife are ingesting these non-food grade plastics. Because I bet most of us actually had plastics. We either had a Ziploc container, we keep food in plastic. And the good thing is that all of that plastic that, is associated with our food, it's actually what we call food grade plastic, so it's safe for eating. It's very specific. It's approved to be, touching food and holding food. And so when we use that plastic, we know that it's safe. But the problem is that all kinds of plastic get released into the environment. And so that stuff can, have chemicals associated with it, and it's not food grade. And so that's really our big concern. It's not that they're eating plastics, but they're actually eating plastics that are not meant to kind of come in contact with food or be consumed at all. And so this is my last slide, and this is work that I just wanted to share. This is work done by my friend Chelsea Rockman, and she's at the University of Toronto. And Chelsea's done some really great work of sampling fish. You can imagine fish are swimming around in the Pacific, and we also have fish in the Great Lakes. And Chelsea actually did some work where she sampled fish in the middle of the Pacific, and she sampled fish in Lake Ontario. And the question is that, people, again, we're trying to compare where where there's the most plastic in these environments. And we look at this map and we say, well, it clearly is a problem in the middle of the ocean. But we don't really know much about the lakes. And so that's something that I think is really important, specifically, for Canadians. We have a lot of lakes, we got a lot of fresh water, and most of us live on a lake system somewhere in the country. And so the question is, for you, is the second quiz of my test is, how many fish, say in 10 sampled in the 2 regions, have microplastics in their stomach? So you can imagine that if you picked 10 fish from the middle of the Pacific, how many do you think would have microplastics in their stomach? And then if you did the exact same thing, if you picked 10 fish from Lake Ontario, how many would have microplastics in their stomach? And again, I'm going to give you a few minutes to think about this and maybe discuss with your class. But what I'm looking for is, do you think that maybe 0 out of 10 or 1 out of 10, or maybe it's 10 out of 10 or 5 out of 10? How many out of 10 fish would have plastics in the Pacific, and how many out of 10 fish would have plastics in Lake Ontario? And I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, and then I'll give you the answer.
And I can play the Jeopardy theme music again, just to get
There we go.
Dun, 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 dun. This is great, guys. And while you guys are thinking too, I wanted to note, so Chelsea in the picture, who you're mentioning, we did a hangout with her in early January, so or December. And we're doing many with plastic pollution researchers all around the globe. So we're really excited to share this with as many classes as possible, and you can look all that up on YouTube as well. So great, guys. All right.
Okay, I'm going to give you 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to share the answers. And this is, I promise, this is the last quiz of the day, for me at least. Okay, so drum roll. Okay, so the answer is, in the Pacific, it was about 10%. So 1 in 10 fish that Chelsea looked in had plastics in their stomach in the Pacific. But in the Great Lakes, where Chelsea does a lot of work right now from the University of Toronto, was 100%. So they looked, I think it's about 500 fish, and every single fish that they've looked at from Lake Ontario all have microplastics in their stomach. And while I think that's, really, really shocking to some of us who look at these maps and say, oh, this is a middle of the ocean problem, I think that it's not that surprising when we actually think about how many cities are around Lake Ontario, how much water flows through Lake Ontario, and really how much human activity is in that region. And so I think one of the things that I hope I've kind of communicated to you is that there's still a lot we don't know. And there are all these hotspots around the oceans as well as around Canada that we really are just beginning to learn about, which is one of the reasons why I really like this area of work that I do. And so with that, I am happy to take any questions that you have. Thanks for listening.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Provencher. So as you're getting off screen share, I just want to note while we're getting ready with the classes, there are quite a few groups watching on YouTube Live. So if you guys have questions as well, you can type them in the chat bar on the right side. Don't be shy, and I will pass them along to Jennifer directly, so please do that. But let's start with Miss Christensen's class. You guys have a question to kick off?
Hi.
Hi.
We have one question. Do you want to stand up, Dibu? Okay.
How much plastic do we have here?
Well, they don't. Where's here?
Like 12.
12.
Ontario.
Guelph, Ontario. That's a great question, and I guess the question, it depends on where you're looking. One of the things that we're doing is looking in the soils and looking in the sediment, and the answer is we actually don't know, and so I would love to be able to tell you, but one of the things that we're working on is looking in places like Guelph, looking in Sterling, I think looking in Thunder Bay, all of these places we haven't really looked. People have been spending a lot of time looking in the oceans, which is where we kind of notice this problem first. And now people are kind of realizing that there's all these other places on land and in the freshwater that we have plastics, and we don't really know. So that's a great question. And all I can say is we're working on it. But if we think about how many people live in your area, it's probably not the highest, but it's probably not the lowest.
Yeah. Outstanding. Well, it's great to have questions that there's no set answer for yet, that we're still seeking to find the answers to, because that's like the basis of science. Excellent. Oh, your mic cut out again, Jen. I don't know what happened. Oh.
My mic cut out?
Your mic, just for that one comment you made at the end there, it cut out.
Oh, I don't even know what it was.
That's odd. Sorry. That's okay. We'll take a second question. We'll head to Miss Mosman Cross's class. Do you guys have a question?
Yeah. Okay. What can we do to help?
Yes.
That's a great question. That's my favorite question, actually. What can you do to help? I think that there are lots of things you can do. I think that, especially for you guys, who brings a lunch? Put up your hand if you bring your lunch to school every day. Yeah, me too. I bring my lunch to school every day. And so one of the things that we can do is make sure that when we're using our plastic, that we're keeping the plastic. We're either recycling it or we're keeping it, because what we don't want is it to go into the garbage. And I think that's the most important thing. There's lots of plastic around, and we're not trying to stop plastic, but what we are trying to do is stop plastic waste. And so every piece of plastic, so if we have bags like this, making sure that we use them over and over again, washing them out, using them, making sure that they go to the recycling. Or if you have things like, if you're using containers, make sure you pack lunches that don't have plastic that you're throwing out every day. So when I was a kid, so I grew up in Brampton, Ontario. Put up your hand if you know where Brampton, Ontario is. Yeah, it's actually really close to Guelph. When I was a kid, we would have lunch and we would have bags like this, and then we would throw them away. We just didn't really know about it. And so one of the things that every person can do every day is make sure you have, I think probably what we call a litterless lunch. So a litter-free lunch. And that's something that you can do every day. And if you get your mom to do it, and your dad and your cousins and your sisters and your brothers, if everyone did a litterless lunch, I think we would be a lot farther ahead.
Outstanding. And we can come back to that at the end as well. One of the things that we'll do at the end of the Hangout is ask where classes can find more, and we can always pass along resources that Environment and Climate Change Canada has about this issue, so classes can do all the stuff and learn how they can help directly, which is great.
Awesome.
Right, let's go to Mr. Cameron's class. Is that a question?
Jackson is coming.
You said that Lake Ontario had the most garbage, but then you also said that the lake with the places with the most red is the most garbage, but Lake Ontario is white. Like there's no red spots in it at all.
Yeah, and so that's a great point. And so the problem is that we just don't have enough data. And so when we use those maps where we have all the red and we have the white, that's actually, it's one the problem is that we don't have enough data to do all the little lakes. So we have data to do the ocean side of it, but we're just starting to think about the lakes. And so the lakes are white, not because there's no plastic, but because we just have no data. And that's actually what Chelsea is working on, and partners that I work really closely. But that's an excellent observation. Absolutely, you're right. And so one of the parts about being a scientist is actually thinking about where do we have no data versus where do we know something doesn't exist. So where do the areas have we looked for plastic and there's no plastic versus we just haven't looked yet. So we have no data. And no data doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that we haven't looked yet.
So just as a quick follow-up on that, because you mentioned that Chelsea sampled about 500 fish in Lake Ontario. So that is, for classes to know, that's like a very small sample size compared to what we're looking for. That's why we call that no data compared to what we could get.
Well, and I think the other important, and that's a really good point. And I think the other point to that is that that map was made about 4 years ago. And so that was based on all of the data they had then. And so people like Chelsea and myself actually look at those maps and go, well, there's all these other areas that we don't have data for. Can we go get the data? So Chelsea's all, you know, when I say that she's gone out and done that, that's only happened in the last 2 years. So that's like, it's happening now. She is a student who are analyzing those fish now. And so I know that data because I work with Chelsea, but that data is not it's not done yet. It will be by the summer. And so maybe the next version of the big map will have that data, but it's those white areas on maps that actually let us know where the work that we need to be doing to fill in the gaps.
Very cool. And thank you for the clarification. Before we go to our fourth class, I want to note again, now we have even more groups watching on YouTube Live, so if you want to write in questions, please write them in. Even if you're an adult, you don't need to be a classroom, just feel free to ask. Let's head, actually, you know what? So I don't know if your mic's working. Let's go to Mrs. Demianakos' class, but I don't think your mic's working yet. So no. So top left of your screen, guys, little blue square, or you could write it on a big board. That works too.
Yes.
I like that solution, but you got to come a little closer. How many animals a day do you think die from plastic? Good question. Difficult.
Ooh, that's a tough question. So I think it depends on the season. And I think it depends on the animal. So probably, okay, well, let me think about this. So if you're thinking about birds, probably there's some every day that die because of plastic, some that colony. If you're talking about whales, we know that some whales every year get caught in fishing nets. And so most people think about plastic, and this is what they think of, right? They think of little pieces of plastic. But one of the things that most people don't think about is that fishing nets are plastic, and that's a big problem too. So many of you may have heard about the right whales getting tangled in the nets in the Atlantic over the last few years and dying. That's actually a plastic. That's a death due to plastic. And so every year whales die. Turtles, huge numbers of turtles get tangled in fishing nets and plastic nets. Fish for sure get tangled. I mean, there's the fishing that the nets do, but then what happens is old nets get tangled, or they get caught on something on the bottom, and they get let go, or they get lost, essentially. And it's those lost nets, or what we call ghost nets, are kind of out in the ocean floating around. Those cause hundreds of deaths every year. So I would estimate that, you know, probably hundreds of animals every day die because of getting entangled in nets. So it's not just about little plastics, it's also about really big plastics, like bigger than this room, that are floating in the ocean, but because they're plastic, they're not breaking down. So you can imagine, you know, 100 years ago, nets would have been made out of cotton, and they would have slowly broken down over time. Now they're made out of plastics, and they just don't degrade. They're just the same.
Stay forever. Great point. All right, so Mr. Vasquez's class, grade 3-4s in Oakville, joined us halfway through the presentation. So if you guys want to go with a question, go right ahead. Yeah, I know. I'm excited.
How do some companies help animals in the sea with plastic?
Good question.
How many animals are in the ocean with plastic?
How do some companies help animals with plastic? What do they do to help or alleviate their plastic pollution?
Yeah, that's a great point. There are lots of companies that are now doing shoreline cleanups, which is great. So removing plastics from the ocean, taking it out of the ocean, that's a great way to do it. There is one group who is actually trying to figure out how to build kind of a floating, you can imagine this like big floating garbage catcher in the middle of the ocean. There are engineers and scientists working on that. So you can imagine it would be like a big net floating at the surface, and then the plastics would flow through, you know, get caught in this device, and then the water would just keep going. And there are lots of companies who are trying to think about less plastic products, and so looking at biodegradable plastics or just not having plastic. And so there are lots of food companies. So whoever, put up your hand if you ever get like takeout food or you know, order food, go to Subway or any of those places, right? Yeah, me too. And what I've started thinking about, and what lots of companies have started to think about, is how can you package food to go within maybe paper or something that can be recycled or broken down. And so I think there are lots of different ways companies are really trying to figure out how they can, again, use plastic, but reduce plastic waste. So keep the plastics in use, keep the plastics around, so we use them over and over again, and we just don't lose them to the environment.
Outstanding. All right, and also halfway through our presentation, I invited in our homeschool group, the Bernsteins in Clevelandville, Wisconsin. So if you guys have a question, go right ahead.
On the place where you showed all the plastics, why did you put wool there?
Wow, you guys have great eye. That is a great question. So wool, I put that in there always to see who's really paying attention. So you guys get a gold star. So one of the problems is that we don't always know what type of polymer it is. And in fact, some of the pieces that we think are plastic are actually things like wool or cotton. It doesn't happen very often, but it does happen every once in a while. And so what we think looks like maybe a plastic fiber, it actually goes into the machine and says that it's wool. And when we start to look at it closer, it is actually wool. It's not plastic. But wool, right, it would shed, it would just like, it's the same as our clothes or other plastics. It would just shed off microplastics or fibers, and then it gets caught up. But the difference is that wool over time would break down in the stomach, whereas the plastic fibers don't. I think the other part is that we also sometimes get wool and we know that it's not wool, or we look at it, and so we're still working on the technology. The engineers are still working on the technology for us to put a piece of plastic in and get the right answer back out. And so I guess that's the other thing that I think is like the best part of my job, is that we don't have all the answers. There's still lots of things that we're figuring out. And so even just in the last, I've worked on this for about 12 years now, we've learned so much, but there's so much more to do, and so one of my favorite parts of my job is working with biologists like me, but working with chemists and working with engineers and working with mathematicians and working with other, people who think about recycling and waste management, because we need all of those people at the table. It's not going to be solved by one person or one group. We really need all different kinds of people to connect with us and think about this problem.
Outstanding. So since we don't have enough time for 6 more questions from all the classes, I want to wrap up just, Jennifer, by asking, is there something that classes, I mean, you've already explained a little bit about what classes can do. Is there a place where they can learn more? So we passed along Climate Kids to our entire newsletter, so every single one of our classrooms will have heard about that. You mentioned shoreline cleanups, so we do hangouts with OceanWise, who coordinate shoreline cleanups, so any one of your classes can coordinate a shoreline cleanup close to them and help clean up plastic of lakes, rivers, and oceans. But is there anywhere else that people can go? Anything else you'd recommend to classes that they can take part in and help solve this issue?
Yeah, I think one of the big, I think the shoreline cleanup is a big one. I think it's not only a way for people to get out there and actually clean up the plastic. I think one of the most important parts of that is that it actually collects data that we can then use as scientists to figure out what the patterns are. And so I think that program is really great because it allows students to actually collect real data, and then that data is actually used by myself, who think about this and help do policies to figure out what's the most common piece of plastic. If we have to tackle something, what is the type of plastic we should be tackling? And so I think that program is a really, really important one. And then the other thing I would say is that the NOAA, so the National Atmospheric and Ocean, NOAA is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration in the U.S. is a big one, and they have a whole suite of lesson plans for teachers on marine debris. And I think that is a really important one that teachers can tap into and talk about this more, because there's all kinds of things to think about, and it can be used, there's lots of data, you can be used to teach kind of math and all kinds of numeracy things. And I think the most important thing is that plastics is one of those topics where it's very concrete. There's all kinds of activities that you can do in your own house or your own classroom to reduce plastics. And every little bit counts, and I think that's the most important part.
Outstanding. What a great message to end us off with. So what we do at the end of every hangout is, boys and girls, if you guys can get ready, I'm going to demute every class's microphone. So if you guys join me in a very loud and huge thank you to Dr. Provencher for joining us today. So yeah, everyone's mic is demuted.
Hi. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Awesome, guys. So yeah, we are going to pass some of those resources online in an email when we're done. Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Provencher. We hope to have you back very, very soon.